Hello, and I thank you for your participation in this project and program. So let me give you a little bit about myself, and by a little bit, I mean very little. This will be a Trivial Pursuit wedge of my life. This is a reference that some of you will get more easily than others. That said, I am an alumnus of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The school is called the Tar Heels, as North Carolina as a state is called the Tar Heel State. So why in the world would anything be called a Tar Heel? So before I begin, I want you to kind of take your own guess and maybe even write it down, or just kind of, memorize what you think a Tar Heel is. And then we'll kind of, weigh what the actual answer is versus what you think it is. Now, a lot of you who are familiar with the concept of Tar Heels know the Tar Heels from sport. The Tar Heels, the UNC basketball team, is one of the most famous basketball programs. A lot of people would call Carolina a blue blood. That is a very popular term in various realms of college basketball, right? You have, like your Carolina, Duke, Kansas, Kentucky, UCLA. There are a ton of different what people would call blue bloods. There are some, teams that I guess I would call new blue or new blue blood. UConn is one of those schools. UConn has won a number of its titles this side of the year 2000. So, a lot of people, when they see the Tar Heels games, whether in the NCAA tournament or, obviously just through whatever streaming device and service you actually are familiar with or have access to, you see the mascot, and the mascot is a ram named Ramses. Now, Ramses is, yes, in fact, a ram, but Ramses is not a Tar Heel. Now, whomever depicts Ramses or is the person within the Ramses outfit definitely is a Tar Heel student, and a lot of times those students, at least 80 to 85% of those Carolina students, are actual members of the Tar Heel State. But Ramses is not a Tar Heel. So for those of you that put down the Ram as what Tar Heels are, sorry, but you are not correct. Ramses actually came from something that started back in the 20s, like 1924, I want to say. The Ram was inspired by a guy named Jack Merritt, who his nickname was the Battering Ram. A cheerleader decided to actually use a live ram, and so there are variations of actual live rams that roam the sidelines at these games, especially Carolina football games, not Carolina basketball, because most of the time you're not going to have an actual animal inside in a basketball arena. I'm getting kind of away from it, but again, a lot of you that are familiar with Carolina, when you see the ram during the games, you might think that's the Tar Heel, and that is definitely not the case. So again, I'm not trying to tell you you're a bad person, just we're eliminating potentialities. So the Tar Heels, once again, going back to the Tar Heel thing, how does North Carolina be named or get named the Tar Heel State, and why would the Tar Heels be the name of choice as a mascot for the University of North Carolina? The story actually roots back to the Civil War, and there was a bit of a threat somewhere around, maybe 2016, 17 through 2020, 21, because the story roots in the Civil War and the southern side of the Civil War, that a lot of people were just kind of like, ooh, that's tacky, blah, blah, blah. Now, I myself am not a big fan of the erasure of history. In fact, I tend to embrace history a ton, especially, truly the more messy, if you let me tell it, the better. Sometimes you learn things a lot better in loss or disaster than you do in victory and Pollyanna, that kind of effect. So that said, to this day, that I don't think that the Tar Heel name will be taken away. It hasn't been taken away. It won't be taken away, probably because Nike has so much money wrapped up into it. Capitalism, ladies and gentlemen, is usually the ultimate decider of whether or not something stays a thing or becomes a thing. So if you are familiar with the history of the Civil War, you know that the Confederacy, the capital of the Confederacy was in Richmond, Virginia, which is probably about, I'd say probably about 100 miles south of Washington, D.C. So in and of itself, there is a lot of like proximity rivalry stuff going on. I mean, if you think of Carolina versus Duke, Carolina and Duke, I think as the crow flies, as old people would say, is probably about, heck, I don't know, maybe about 10 miles apart, the two campuses. Now, when you factor in traffic and stoplights and all that kind of stuff, the drive can be anywhere between 12, 15, or 20 minutes. So that said, it's crazy how close those schools are to one another. Well, going back to the Civil War, the Union strategy had to change because the Southern or Confederate side really had a lot of ways to strengthen their lines. First and foremost, a lot of the battles that took place in the Civil War after, say, 1863, 1862, 1863, really took place on the Southern theater or in Southern towns. There weren't a lot of wars or battles of the war that actually took place in what we would consider the North now. There were a lot of battles, for instance, Bull Run was in Northern Virginia. You had Gettysburg, which is in Pennsylvania. You know, there were a number of different Antietam, this and that. You know, there were some northern campaigns, but the southern campaigns and theater were the biggest change that the Union decided to make. The South had a railroad system where they could, you know, load up supplies and or soldiers in order to kind of keep their lines stocked for a full battle. So what happened when the war got to Tennessee, the theater of Tennessee, so you're talking about Shiloh and some of these things, the North really started to make a more Western approach. They figured that if they could kind of tend to gain control of the Mississippi River, they would be able to not only resupply as efficiently as the South, but they would take away another critical artery that the South actually possessed and utilized. So that's when you started to have campaigns in Mississippi, places like Vicksburg, for instance. But one of the biggest things that happened from Tennessee was the advancement of Sherman, General Sherman, and Sherman's march to the ocean. So what Sherman did, he effectively went from central/eastern Tennessee, and he took his soldiers with him, or led his soldiers through the channels of Tennessee, Georgia, and effectively along the border of South Carolina and into South Carolina a little bit, going all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. What this effectively did was, you know, behead the Confederate states. You know, you're now isolating the Carolinas and Virginia, the kind of head of the government, as it were, from the body, which was more the Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee kind of thing. So when Sherman made his march, that changed the game. That really turned the tide of the Civil War. And so with the Northerners, the Union, making their influx from the West, they really applied pressure. Now they had ways that they were applying pressure from the east, in that Georgia corridor, so that really started to attack the body, as it were, the body of the South and the Confederacy. So now all that was left as you get into 1864 and 1865, for the most part, is the actual head of the Confederacy in the Carolinas, as well as in Virginia. So as the war really started to wear itself down, the generals in Virginia saw themselves in a real predicament. They were in quite a pickle because they understood not only was their, once mighty momentum in this war gone, but effectively they could kind of see the war ending. They could kind of see that the Union was really creeping in on Richmond, and some of the more critical aspects of what the Confederacy actually was. And so by default, a lot of the soldiers also saw that. And, for what it's worth, a lot of soldiers were like, dude, I could be at home hanging out with my wife and kids instead of sitting here trying to fight a battle that I know is not going to end in the ways that I want it to. And so what ended up happening, of course, were a lot of Confederate soldiers decided, you know what, it's better for me to go home, tend to my cattle, love my wife, raise my kids, than to be a part of a losing effort. And so what happened was a lot of these soldiers started dipping out, bouncing off rank, going AWOL, just deserting, deciding it was much better to go home. And a lot of the generals of Virginia and the Confederacy, as these battles started to make their way toward Richmond, they decided, we've got to find anything to motivate these guys. And they were offering cash for fighting. They were offering, all kinds of, promises of land or supplies, weaponry, whatever they could to try to entice people to stay. And in one particular battle, the amount of deserters was fairly amazing. The generals leading this particular battle saw that their soldiers were just dropping rank because the Union really had them choked on a few different sides, and these guys just broke out. Scattered in every direction. Well, not every direction. Obviously, they wanted to run away from the guns, a lot of them, but they just left. They ran. They were, you think about it. If you're fighting a losing battle, unless you have a lot of pride for what you're doing, you're gone. You're deciding you're going to get out of there. And so a lot of them did. And at this one particular battle, they saw that as the smoke cleared, as all these various men were dropping their guns or just generally running away, they turned, and there was one general in particular that saw that there was a line of guys who never broke rank, who never fell from their column that, they had entrenched themselves in. They stood there as the smoke parted, as this particular general said. They stood there as if they had tar on their heels. And this particular group was a set of men from the Carolinas. So that's how North Carolina got to be the Tar Heel state, and the university took the mascot as the Tar Heels. So the Tar Heels are less a animated plushy mascot and more a symbol of the determination to stay with a cause. The Tar Heel is a decision that no matter what the result may be, to literally stick to your ground, to hold firm in what you believe in, and at very worst, to fight for something that you love. And I think that's such a wonderful metaphor for so many aspects of who we are as people, whether you're a Southerner, a Northerner, a Duke or an NC State fan, whether you're from the East Coast or the West Coast, no matter your demographic, racially, spiritually / religiously, culturally. I think a lot of us across our lives can really grasp that concept. You can really tap into the fact that through thick or thin, hell or high water, I'm really going to fight for those that I love, those that I believe in, or the causes that I think are worth my truest, most almost primitive energies. My desire to lay my life on the line is much greater because I believe in this thing. And that in and of itself, like I said, is a wonderful principle and is the true principle behind what the mascot of the University of North Carolina is. And that is being a Tar Heel. So now, some 23 years later, after leaving the University of North Carolina, 23, of course, being quite an iconic number in Carolina numerology, I can look back at my experience at Carolina, and I look at my life now and the things that my life has shown me, the things that my life have presented that I never could have seen. And I'm so thankful to have had that story to lean on, because there are so many times within my life where I didn't think that I could go on, where I thought there was no answer. I thought that there was no recourse. I would stonewall. I would get stuck. I would go into bouts of depression because it felt like it was too much. But somehow, having that willingness, again, regardless of the result, to have that very steely determination to know that what I was going into, up against, or through was actually truly worth my time, effort, and energy. That ultimately is what drove me through so many things and what propels me now in my life, because I have, like all of you, a number of things on my plate. And here I am today with all those things on my plate, knowing that instead of having to eat it all at once, I can just take it bite by bite. And I can truly, ultimately, instead of running and being scared and doing something else, I can hold my ground in the face of everything that looks difficult, as if I have tar on my heels.